Good evening. Welcome to PoliticIt podcast. Tonight we have Derek Brown. Derek's running for Attorney General.
I am.
Nice to have you, Derek. I've known you for a while. I mean, you were one of the best party chairs we'd had.
I think that's when we first got to know each
Yeah.
other, was this party when I was party chair.
Yeah, and so that's interesting. So why don't you tell people a little bit about you? Because I know people know you from that, but I think it'd be nice for people to kind of get to know you.
Well, and it's funny, you're right. Most people that know me in the political arena know me from, the time that I spent serving as party chair during the pandemic, which adds, a whole new level of stress, and things worked out great. I think we had a really successful couple of years, but my background is I'm a lawyer by training. After law school, I clerked for a federal judge, an appeals court judge, and for the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, which is all the federal appeals in the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware area. And so it was a phenomenal experience to get not just in a courtroom, but behind the courtroom in the judges' chambers, and to work with a lot of judges and see how decisions are made and the thought process. And so I also, after that, Senator Mike Lee, who wasn't a senator at the time, recruited me to join him at a firm where we practiced constitutional and appellate law together.
Oh,
And so
cool.
I spent some time in a law firm, the law firm Sidley Austin. It's a Chicago firm. I was in the New York or the DC office. And then from there, I spent some time on Capitol Hill working as chief counsel for a U.S. senator. We came back to Utah. I practiced law here for a while. I was also
So what
in
senator did you?
Senator Bennett.
Oh,
I was his chief counsel.
Oh, I did.
I was in the belly of the beast, as I
Yeah.
called it. I mean, literally the Senate Dirksen building and negotiating bill language, seeing how the sausage is made, seeing how completely dysfunctional Congress is up close and personal, and seeing how the federal government is controlling every aspect of our life. And it was a fascinating and frustrating experience for me to see that whole process. And then from there, I was back in Utah and I served in the State House of Representatives and got to see a government system that actually runs really well. I mean, our legislature tackles and solves problems in a way that Congress never could.
In a very short period of time.
Exactly, and they do good work, and so I did that, and then I left that in the middle of my term when Senator Lee came to me and said, "Look, I really need some help. Would you be my deputy chief of staff? Work with me, help me run my offices?" And so I did that. I was his deputy chief of staff
In Washington.
No, we were here in Utah.
You were in the
He wanted us to go back to DC, but I had kids in high school, and it just
Okay.
didn't make sense to move back, so we did it here. And I ran the offices here in Utah and was the go-between with the chief of staff, and really was on the front
Was
lines.
that Allison at that time?
Yes, and Boyd Matheson.
Oh, and Boyd Matheson.
And so we worked with them on, I mean, all the issues that Senator Lee cares about, the federal overreach, protecting the Constitution. I mean, that's why I did it, is because, for me, the idea of pushing back against federal overreach and really keeping the federal government in its place and promoting the Constitution and enumerated powers. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, and I felt strongly enough about it that I left my seat in the House and worked for Senator Lee.
Oh, interesting. And so that was you'd had a tie with Senator Lee before.
I did.
in your law firm. And so
Exactly.
he's come out now and endorsed you. Right?
He has, he's endorsed me, and he and I have talked a lot about some of the things that Utah can do. I mean, if this one of the biggest cases right now is this Chevron deference case,
Right.
which I don't know how many of your listeners are aware of, but this
Well,
is
why don't you explain that just a little
Oh.
bit? Because I think it's a fascinating case.
Well, I mean, as a lawyer, this is the kind of stuff that, in fact, last Saturday night, Senator Lee and I were sort of geeking out about this because most people probably haven't heard about Chevron deference, but this is the biggest case no one's heard of yet. But I think everyone will be talking about it. And the idea is it's this legal doctrine, and I first learned about it in law school in the 90s. And I've hated it ever since then. And the doctrine basically says when federal agencies do something that may extend beyond the power Congress has given them, or they reinterpret a statute in a way they shouldn't, we just let them do it. We just assume they're the experts, and we just give them that deference. And it's something we should never do, because they now trample on states' rights in every conceivable way. In fact, I was just talking with an attorney general in another state who led the charge against what's called the dishwasher rule. And what that is the Department of Energy imposed requirements on dishwasher manufacturers for energy and power usage. They limited how much water a dishwasher can use, going well beyond what it is that Congress ever said they could do. And so, I mean, that seems like a little bit of a silly example, but it just gives you an example.
So the judge will basically go to the agency and say, "Is that how you interpret this law?" Right?
Exactly.
And they'll just say, "Oh, yes."
Oh, yes. And we have good reason for doing that because we're the experts under Chevron deference.
Right.
Well, if the Supreme Court, which just heard this case about a month ago, if they say, no, actually, we're not going to continue with Chevron deference, that changes everything. And a lot of the really nefarious things like Biden's climate policy, the way that he gets that through isn't through Congress. I mean, Congress is divided. They're not really doing much. The way he gets it through is utilizing the agencies, utilizing BLM, utilizing EPA, and getting them to reinterpret existing statutes. So, I mean, as the Attorney General, this is what I would spend my time pushing back against. I mean, I did this.
You look at the whole Antiquities Act and all that,
Oh.
and things that I'm sure have come out of that, right?
Well, and that's a 1906 act that, I mean, it's been updated a little bit, but it causes all sorts of problems for Utah. And Congress could solve it just like that. They could solve it tomorrow, but they're not going to.
Right.
And so that's why it's so critical that we push back. And in fact, right now, as a state, we have over 60 lawsuits specifically on lands and lands-related issues pushing back. So that's what an attorney general does.
So now if all of a sudden this case, the Chevron doctrine's reversed, then you've, as an attorney general, would have a lot of work to do.
There'd be a lot of work to do. And in fact, another person who supports me in addition to Senator Lee is the Speaker of the House, Mike Schultz. And Speaker Schultz has said, look, we'll support you as well. I mean, this will require a lot of funding to push back in all these areas. But, I've said, look, you fund it, I will file it. And I will, because there will be so many areas, whether it's education or energy or, I mean, you name it, lands policy, commerce. There are so many areas where Congress they've passed this watered down legislation, and then agencies
just run with it.
Well, yeah, it's creating a legal vacuum, and those mid-level bureaucrats, these mid-level bureaucratic lawyers, really is what they are more than happy to step into that vacuum. And so that's why states need an attorney general who is assertive, who's proactive, who can work with the legislature to go after these kinds of issues.
I've heard people say that, and maybe it's because of this, endorsement by Senator Lee, but I've heard the term establishment candidate when they refer to you. And so, how do you respond to that?
It's just this one of these catch-all. It's like a political pot shot is really all it is. Like, there's a reason Senator Mike Lee supports me. It's because, I mean, a lot of people in this race and every race, I mean, that's part of politics is to say, I'll do this and this. But
yeah, well, and it's kind of funny when it comes to Senator Lee, too, because I've never considered him the establishment.
Yeah. Right? Well, I mean, the people who might say you're establishment, you would have never accused Senator Lee of doing that. And the reality is Senator Lee knows who I am. I mean, I've spent the last 2 decades of my life pushing back against federal government overreach. I mean, I've seen this in private practice. I've seen this on the Hill. I've seen this in the state legislature. I've seen this when I worked for Senator Lee. I've seen this in my private practice where I've helped companies push back against even state overreach. I mean, this is what I've done with Senator Lee. And so one of the reasons I think that he supports me is because while everyone is saying, well, elect me and I promise that I'll start doing X, Y, Z, I've actually been doing it for the last 20 years. I have got a track record of doing it.
Yeah, very good. We're going to take a break.
All right.
We'll be right back. Hey Siri, how do I get to the state capitol?
John, the fastest way to get to the Capitol is to make a lot of empty promises, to get help from special interest groups and endorsements from politicians. You will also need to buy a better suit.
That's not going to work for me, Siri. You need to find another way.
John, listen to me. If you're going to win your race, you will need to play the political game. You also need to use more hairspray and buy a golden retriever. Also, a new phone case would be nice.
It's enough of this.
John, are you there? Did you just leave me on the road? Fine. Keep your principles, John.
My name's John Johnson. I'm not running to be part of a system, and I don't owe anyone special favors. I'm running to listen to and work for you. I'm running to get results.
Welcome back to PoliticIt. We're talking to Derek Brown. Derek's a candidate for Attorney General, former Republican Party chair for the state of Utah. So, we talked about this idea that, you kind of addressed this idea that people are saying, well, he's the establishment hack, right?
That's funny. But
yeah, and another thing that comes up with that, though, is that people say, well, Derek was a lobbyist.
Oh, exactly. And these are, again, it's a political pot shot. And what's funny is they actually said that, ironically, about Senator Mike Lee. I mean, when he ran in 2010 for the first time, I mean, that was one of the criticisms they lobbied at him and said, hey, he's, in addition to lawyer, he's a lobbyist. But the reality is, what you have to do as a lawyer is not just give good legal advice, but help your clients in whatever the form, whether it's in court, whether it's with regulatory agencies, the legislature. I mean, it's critical that companies have the ability to push back against government overreach. I mean, one of the things that I've done, like with Senator Lee, is push back against federal government overreach. But you know as well as anyone that the state governments do this as well, don't they? I mean, you've pushed back against this as well. I mean, how often do state governments, including our own state of Utah, pick winners and losers, and then companies find themselves without any warning on the losing side of things? I mean, those companies have a right to get in there and help people understand what it is that the impact of that legislation is. And so I'm proud to do that in the way that Senator Lee did, and proud to help my clients figure out and navigate that sort of difficult political and constitutional and legal arena.
And then they'll come back and they'll say, well, Derek, though, you were also a lobbyist for Facebook.
Exactly. Well, and it's funny because the reality is, a couple of years ago, the governor said one of the biggest issues that's facing us socially, legally, as a society is social media. So we are going to fix this. We're going to do something about this. And so Meta actually hired me. I mean, of the thousands of attorneys here in Utah, they said, we need someone to help us work through this problem. What do we do? And my job was to help them sit down at the table with the governor's office, with the legislature, with the policymakers, and figure out, how do you navigate the constitutional issues, which are very difficult, the technological issues and the social issues. How do you work through that in a way that gives parents the tools that they need? And that's what we did. And I think we came up with some really good ideas that were really groundbreaking, because these are difficult legal issues. I mean, it's one thing to just give legal advice. It's another thing to really grapple with the constitutional issues that are involved in this kind of a thing. I mean, and there's a reason that, ironically, the two legislators, Senator Collimore and Representative Tusher, who sponsored these social media bills, are very supportive of me and my campaign, is because they've seen me in action. They've seen me sitting down, bringing people together and working through these difficult legal issues and coming up with solutions that work for parents, that work for kids, that work for Utah. And so I'm proud of the work that we've done, and it's difficult legal work.
And one of the jobs I see as Attorney General isn't that one of your jobs, is to talk to the legislature, to get them on your side?
Absolutely.
Do what you want to do.
Well, they fund the office. So a lot of people think that the Attorney General's job is to just, poke holes at the legislature. They fund the office. And I think one of the things you can do is, as Attorney General, look, there's a level of independence, and that's a good thing. I mean, this idea that it should be an appointed position, I mean, I don't support this. And frankly, I don't know of anyone who does. It's kind of just a goofy sort of topic that comes up here and there. But the reality is,
you're not the governor's lawyer.
You're not. No. And there's this level of separateness, right? There's an independence, and that's a good thing. But the other thing the AG does is and I'm willing to stand alone if I need to, But the reality is people like Speaker Schultz, who also support my candidacy, have said, look, I'm with you. There are a lot of areas where I want to push back against on education issues, on energy issues, on policy generally. And I think the AG, if it's most effective, is someone who can work with the legislature, because it costs a lot of there's resources involved in doing this. And that's okay when you have a legislature who's willing to fund that, which, they've made it clear that they are. But those are the kinds of things that an attorney general does, is you're running the state's largest law firm, but you're also working with the other branches of government, because a lot of the lawsuits that you file aren't in a vacuum. You file them after you've worked with the agencies who have identified an issue that is impacting them.
Well, the other thing that's going on, I mean, I had Ken Paxton on a few weeks ago, and it's kind of interesting. The more he went after the administration, the Biden administration, and others, the more this lawfare kind of kicked in and started going after him.
Right. Well, and I think that what's happening in Texas, and specifically Governor Abbott has identified this, is we are having this battle. It's a 10th Amendment battle, is really what it comes down to. And it's coming to a head. And ultimately, I think that the biggest battles we're going to see in the years ahead aren't necessarily going to take place in Congress. They're going to be in the courtrooms. I mean, that's ultimately what it is. And so in Texas, that's why we're seeing these battles play out on immigration. I mean, what's happening at the border is just a complete mess. And as I mentioned earlier,
it affects our state.
It affects us. I mean, we're not a border state, but in terms of the impacts, we sort of are a border state. And Congress, and I've seen this because I've worked in Congress multiple times now, they could solve the issue tomorrow. I mean, the solutions are not that complicated. I'm sorry, we have dealt with far more complicated issues as a society. These are not complicated issues. They could solve them tomorrow. They're not going to. And if there's one takeaway from everything going on, it's that they're not going to solve them. And so it then becomes critical that each state has an attorney general who's willing to push back and willing to say to the federal government, no. And I love that we've done that as a state with the new bill that was just passed.
Yeah.
Flipping the paradigm, saying rather than just doing whatever they tell us to do, what we will do is identify if there's an area that we believe violates the 10th Amendment, we won't do it. And then the burden is on the federal government to force us. And in that case, we'll be on the receiving end of the lawsuit as a state. And then the question is, do we have an attorney general willing and able to defend the law? And the answer is yes, because it's critical that the AG does that. It wasn't that long ago when we had an attorney general who wasn't willing to defend the state's abortion law, and it set up a real battle with the governor who wanted it defended. So that is one of the things that the AG does is defend the state laws as they're passed.
Very good. So in conclusion, why don't you talk into that camera and give a pitch?
A pitch
for why should voters in Utah hire Derek?
Well, I appreciate that. So again, my name is Derek Brown, and I appreciate, John, the opportunity to be here. And a number of years ago, the Supreme Court issued a decision, and in that decision, although I didn't agree with the outcome of the decision, they said something that I will never forget. They said states are separate and independent sovereigns. Sometimes they need to act like it. I'm running for Attorney General because Utah is a separate and independent sovereign, and it needs an Attorney General who is willing to make sure that it acts like it. So again, my name is Derek Brown, and I'd appreciate your vote.
Perfect. Thank you, Derek. Nice having you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I appreciate this time.
And we'll see you guys next week.
All right.